Welcome to Church Pulse Weekly. It's Carrie Newhoff here, and I'm joined by David Kinnaman. David, great conversation last week with John Mark Comer, and you're going to continue it.
Yeah, absolutely, Carrie. So good to be with you all. Thanks for listening in and tuning in. John Mark was incredible last week as we talked with him about some of the challenges of reframing our work in the world, and the fact that as Christians we actually believe in the devil and in spiritual warfare and the challenges there. So that was in the last episode, and today I got to sit down with John Mark and talk with him some of the other challenges that he's facing as it relates to sort of church leadership, the future of the church, what he's thinking about, some of the pressure points that he's keeping track of, and what we can do as church leaders practically to get over some of the hurt with people leaving our churches without ever saying anything to us.
Well, for all the leaders who are sitting there going, I wish I could have like dinner with John Mark and pick his brain. This is what these two episodes are. So one does not depend on the other. If you missed last week, you can catch up later. You may want to start it first. It's up to you. Anyway, this is the second part of the conversation with John Mark Comer. Thank you so much for tuning in to Church Pulse Weekly. By the way, if you're new, welcome, and please subscribe, share, rate, and review. And in the meantime, enjoy part two of the conversation with John Mark Comer.
Well, I'm here again with John Mark Comer. Last time on Church Pulse Weekly, we had a great conversation about live no lies and millennials and Gen Z, what might be the difference. And here we are, a couple 40 somethings talking about younger generations like we really know something. I guess we've done some research and you've preached to a few of them, but
I have a few of them living in my home. That's the only authority I can speak to it.
Fair enough. Well, my kids are sort of tired of being my research guinea pigs, so I'm sure that's the case. So John Mark Comer is the founding pastor of Bridgetown Church in Portland, Oregon, and the best-selling author of The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry and a brand new book called Live No Lies. John Mark, thanks for joining us.
Always happy to be with you, David.
Yeah, thanks. It was such a great conversation last time. I encourage listeners to go back and check that out. We want to talk today a little bit about some of the larger cultural trends, sort of state of the church, faith and well-being in America. As though we didn't cover enough of the biggies last time, I want to start by just talking a little bit about some data that we just collected a couple of months ago about perceptions of local churches. So you can stand by here just as we kind of cover a few stats. So when we were looking at U.S. adults, we had 5 positive perceptions, 5 negative perceptions. The positive perceptions were that churches today offer hope to people. That was 74% of Americans actually agree with that, which is a pretty significant number. 3 out of 4 Christian and non-Christians say that Christian churches in their community offer hope to people, which is awesome. Cares about people like me at 60%, trustworthy 59%, generous 61%, making a real difference is 53%. And then we turn to some of the negative perceptions, and we're going to go from bottom to top here, the most common. So the least common of the top 5 was hypocritical at 33%, detached from the real issues my community is facing at 30%, irrelevant to me 36%, judgmental 37%, and then the top negative perception is known for the things that they're against. And in each of the cases of these negative perceptions, millennials are the most likely generation among adults to say those are true of the churches in my community. So certainly the church has even a more significant reputation problem, image problem among younger generations of Americans. So my first question,
David, are millennials more negative on their view of the church than Gen Z, or were those kind of measured together?
In our adult studies, it's 18 plus. And so Gen Z is just 18 to 22-year-olds right now. And so they're a little bit small in our sampling to be able to take an accurate picture as to how they compare to millennials. So that's a simple technical answer to that question. But
got it.
So we can say that millennials compared to Gen Xers, compared to boomers, and then compared to elders are certainly the most skeptical of churches.
Right.
But actually, and we'll get to this in a little bit, there's some interesting good news about millennials, which we'll cover in a couple of minutes. But just your thoughts on sort of perceptions. The church still has some generally positive perceptions, but there's this a sort of percentage of people, especially young people, who have these entrenched negative perceptions of local churches. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm surprised so many people think the church is trustworthy. That's higher than I would have guessed. I mean, my experience was that prior to the election of President Trump, this is just anecdotal, I have no evidence for this, but that we had made extraordinary grounds in kind of recapturing a good reputation as the church among young people in cities like Portland. Prior to that election, I mean, literally Christians were known as like the ones who do the most social justice and volunteer the most for the city. I mean, to this day, of the 1,500 foster families in Portland, where like many cities, the epidemic of parentlessness is a major problem, 1,200 of the 1,500 were directly recruited out of the churches. So that's extraordinary, but I feel like in the last 4.5, 5 years, that's been completely eclipsed by all the political kind of stuff. So I felt like we were finally recovering ground lost through all the culture wars of the 80s and 90s and all the moral majority stuff in the eyes of a lot of secular millennials. And I feel like we lost it. So in some sense, those numbers are better than I would have expected,
Yeah, well, that's good. I mean, I think it's good
Which is
to
good.
surprise people with the fact that we're still living in the halo or the twilight of sort of Christian conviction, and in some ways, things aren't as bad as sometimes we are led to believe or we imagine.
And I don't think we can define success as everybody likes us. I mean,
Correct.
Jesus was very clear: "Woe to you when all people speak well of you." And now, in particular, where there's two types of judgment. There's where non-Christians judge Christians because they're not like Christ. That's one thing, which is a very legitimate critique.
Yep.
Then there's judgment where non-Christians judge Christians because they are like Christ. And that's very different.
Right.
And so, but those numbers, of course, get kind of mixed up together, I'm sure, in a survey.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I think we've done a lot of that kind of trying to sift the places where people have the right perceptions of Christianity doing what it's meant to do, and then the right perceptions of what Christianity is meant not to do, and those sort of unchristian perceptions that we try to track. So what have you done? What did your church do? What have you been trying to do to try to reclaim or stake a higher ground against some of those negative perceptions, especially, or to reaffirm the things that the church is for? What are some things you saw practically expressed in this last 18 months that might provide some real ideas for church leaders? Like how could we reclaim that sort of credibility and public witness in our communities?
Well, I mean, part of it is just loving and serving, in practical ways, in particular areas of justice. And so that's where churches are just an extraordinary resource of generosity. I mean, I couldn't even give you the number off of my head, but the number of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of just lunches that we made every day for our houseless neighbors and people in need and children that from under-resourced neighborhoods and families that are out of school. I mean, just very practical things where the church is kind of at our best when like, hey, we need you to rally. We need you to give this much money, make these many things, bring this many, this many goods and services and stuff, drop it off at the church parking lot in COVID. And we did so much of that, So there's stuff like that I think is an easy win because there's no moral disagreement. It's not like human sexuality or whatever, where you're dealing with these jarringly kind of different moral visions of the good. It's like, no, we all agree that poverty is not a good thing. Let's and hunger is not a good thing. Let's serve together. I still think preaching, I mean, maybe I'm from the wrong generation. I just still believe in preaching if it's good. And I think there's a kind of preaching that can be thoughtful and winsome and compelling and doesn't have to be blisteringly smart, but can be, helpful in kind of recalibrating people's perception of who Christ is, what Christians are, what the Christian way is. And I still think that role is more important now, not less. Of course, I'm biased.
I couldn't agree more with those assessments. And I've concluded based on a lot of our research that the preaching is actually more important than ever. It's just less sufficient to make all of the sort of shifts for the sake of the credibility of the church. But
100%.
that if you don't use that as one of the bare minimums of how the church shows up, you can't just sort of action your way or community service your way through this. Otherwise you end up just becoming a social club with Jesus sort of on your bumper stickers. We talked in the last episode about the exhaustion you're feeling and that we're hearing from so many leaders, especially local church leaders who didn't expect to lead through, the first digital Easter and the first sort of digital digital
May
worship
be the
motion.
last, oh Lord.
So, what are the things that you're thinking about right now about the greatest challenges that the church is facing at this moment? We're probably not post-pandemic, but we're in the midst of the pandemic and all the sort of outflow of the social and political challenges and economic challenges and the moment in the world that the church finds itself. What do you think are some of the greatest challenges? And I'll come back and ask you about some of the greatest opportunities.
I think holding to Christian orthodoxy is becoming increasingly difficult. There's a corruption of Christian orthodoxy from the left, and there's a corruption of Christian orthodoxy from the right. And you may have both in your church. You may have one in your church based on where you are and what kind of people you are serving. But that's a challenge because it's a lot of work. It's a lot of emotional work because you get attacked, not for making mistakes, but for actually doing your job, for staying true to Christ. There's a getting attacked because you said something or did something that you should not have said or did. That's legitimate. The response to that is you apologize and you repent of your sin and you change direction. Then there's a getting attacked because you said what you were supposed to say and you did what you were supposed to do. And that's a different thing. And so there's an emotional challenge to that. Like, holy cow, how often can I be in people's crosshairs and I'm the bullseyes on my forehead all the time? And then there's the practical challenge of, all right, we have to, part of the function of the church and of the pastor is an educational function. It's a teaching function. Jesus was a rabbi, he was a teacher. What did he do? He went around basically teaching and preaching and then demonstrating the gospel through acts of love and service and the miraculous. So, if you want to summarize what the job is, it's that. So there's a teaching function, and it's just a lot more work because you have to start way farther back. Like when we teach on human sexuality, which we do, I can't do like a 5-minute aside in the middle of a sermon on what we believe about, postmodern gender theory. I have to do like a 6-week sermon series. And these people are used to hearing like TED Talks and in-depth podcasts from brilliant writers and thinkers and pithy, not that we all have to be brilliant, but like their expectations are high. And so it's just a lot of work. That's just time. It's work. A lot of it is just sweat equity. I think most pastors actually can do a decent job. It just takes time. And, if you give time to that, that's time you're not giving to other things. And it's not like pastors have a lot of extra time on their hands where they're just sitting around like, thinking. Yeah. So I think those are that's probably the one I feel the most just because I'm in Portland. And then, of course, individualism continues to be a massive problem. And I think the more online the church becomes, the harder it will be to deal with that problem. Because we already have just a culture where it's very kind of like, just do your own thing and be true to yourself and whatever. And the more church becomes disconnected from actual embodied community, the more challenging I think that will be at some levels.
Yeah. Interesting. And opportunities.
Yep. I think this is going to sound like negative, but I don't mean it negative. I think a lot of the ideas and ideologies of secular culture on both the left and the right of the culture war are failing. So there was a time like, you could date it to like maybe Paris Hilton, but when it felt like secularism was not only like ascendant and was triumphing over Christianity, but it was just a good time. You know what I mean? It was just playful, and who wouldn't want to be out just looking beautiful and handsome and having sex with whoever you want without consequence and being rich and having brunch on Sunday instead of church? There was almost this like glamour, around secularism.
I was trying to figure out where the Paris Hilton reference was.
I just feel like she's the poster child of that. Like, you know what I mean? There was even like, this is a sensitive example, and I say it with great sobriety. But if you look at Hollywood's portrayal of sexuality, which is weird because you should not look at Hollywood's portrayal of sexuality, so please don't hear me saying go do this. But over the last 10 or 15 years, it's gotten significantly darker. So if you think about like popular level films in the early 2000s, where it was like this kind of playful, take off your shirt and the couple falls in bed together, and it's like this fun kind of thing. Now it's like increasingly hookup culture, transactional, dark, almost like depressive almost. You look at like the death of rom-coms almost. You look at the difference between like a Hitch or a Sleepless in Seattle and like The Big Shtick, you know? And I mean, this is a totally different moment, you know, very, very different kind of moment. And so I think the hidden silver lining in that is that the glamour of life without God is falling. And what's left is like, what the crap is happening to our country, and why have so many people gone mad, and why am I so angry and anxious and down and lonely, and why does my life, like, brunch is awesome on Sunday mornings until it's like not enough to satisfy your soul anymore. And then maybe you turn to politics, or you turn to yoga, or you turn to whatever, and then that's maybe fine for a while, and then there's just still this empty cavern in your heart. And so I think there's an incredible opportunity right now where the idols of secular culture are failing. And I'm praying that there's a reopening to God and to Christian spirituality.
Fascinating. You guys at Bridgetown did a series on what you call the future church early this year that offered great ideas of what the church could be in a pandemic-shaped world filled with a lot of hurt, isolation, chaos. Tell us more about the vision behind that series.
Yeah, that wasn't us saying like, this is the future of the church in West. That was for our church, you know?
Right.
But yeah, I think we're all asking how do we not only survive exile, but how do we thrive in it, or whatever, you know? That's a little cheesy, but how do we flourish and stay resilient and grounded in not just Christian orthodoxy, but in Christ himself through this kind of a moment where there's so much like chaos just in the news, and then there's hostility coming at us for following Jesus. And, you know, I think a lot of people much smarter than me have drawn parallels between our cultural moment today and kind of the 4th, 5th, and 6th century in the decline of the Roman Empire. And if you look at that moment as Rome kind of went into disarray, as these tribal bands and the Visigoths kind of came in and sacked Rome, and the church, once it was legalized, had this new problem where now corruption and compromise became the dominant issue. Before, it was like martyrdom was the main problem. Women and children were being brutally murdered. Now the main problem was like, oh, that senator just became a quote Christian, but was he really Christian, or was that a political power play? And now there's compromise and corruption with Rome and the church, and, you know, pastors getting involved in politics and all the wonky stuff. So there was like kind of decay and decline in the culture, and corruption and compromise in the church, which I think is very similar to where we're at right now in the church in the West. And if you look at what happened, you had this whole movement of the desert fathers and mothers, of like really serious Christians that went out into the desert to like pray. And then out of that came monasticism and kind of these rules of life. St. Benedict, of course, in the 6th century with his most popular, The Rule of St. Benedict, arguably one of the most influential documents in Western history, still used to this day by thousands of monasteries all around the world. And so we just basically said, we think the future is ancient. We think rule of life, or that's ancient language, that's weird to modern people, way of life, rhythm of life, whatever you prefer, moving toward order in a time of chaos, moving toward resilience and kind of resolute discipleship in a time of compromise and conviction. That's the future. So basically we're, you know, I can't help but I think we're trying to make what membership was to churches of the past, we're trying to make rule of life, if not to churches of the future, at least to our church in the future. How do we rebuild our church around rule of life? To join our church, we basically say, not just I'm coming on a Sunday, or even I'm giving, but I'm going to join a neighborhood-based community, eating the Lord's Supper around a table, bread and wine, a full meal together, practicing the way of Jesus, and living by this kind of shared rule of life that's contextualized for our city, for our time, for iPhone era, all of that. So the Future Church series was basically an attempt to walk our church into this rule of life through the ache. And you never start with like, you know, you need to practice silence and solitude. You start with, we're anxious all of the time. You never start with, you need to join a small group. You start with, we're lonely, you know. You never start with, you're bad because you're sinning all the time. You start, with fasting. You start with like this deep ache in all of us for purity, you know. So I think it was an attempt to kind of speak to the ache, and out of that ache of our cultural moment, pastor our church into a rule of life that we hope will carry us forward into trust and obedience to Jesus in the years to come.
Pretty cool vision to move this idea of church membership to a new sort of metric, a new way of thinking about that. Just talk about the background to that thinking for you.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm pastoring in Portland. It's a really hard place. I don't think anywhere is easy to pastor, but Pew Research Center just found us the least religious city in America. I mean, I don't know, you can spin all those stats, but there's not a lot of Christians here. And the ideological pressure of the city is overwhelming. And, Portland's an interesting cultural matrix because it's kind of a destination city for people who are deconstructing their faith. Like one Uber driver said to me recently, I'm a black sheep and I moved here because it's a city full of black sheep. That was his lens. And you see a lot of people that come from more religious, more Christian, more conservative parts of the country, the South, the Midwest, who move to Portland because they're drawn to some part of the kind of vibe, the culture, the beer, the coffee, the food, whatever. But often the model of discipleship that they grew up in is just nowhere even close to resilient enough to survive a city like Portland. And the same would be true of a lot of other cities now.
Right.
So, my buddy AJ Swoboda, who pastored here for 10 years with me, called it the New Oregon Trail. Basically, people from conservative Christian backgrounds, often who had a negative experience in church, moved to Portland and began to they don't have a rule of life. They don't have a robust community. They don't have a faith worldview that can survive the sophistication and the hostility of the secular soil here. And they kind of they either deconstruct their faith or they just kind of brunch away their faith on Sunday. Either way, a couple of years in, they're no longer really Christian in any meaningful sense. And so I think trying to arrest that pastorally, again, people do what people do. We can't control people, nor should we. But how do we create a community that's compelling? It's an alternative vision that is more compelling than that of Portland. And how do we help people have a basic kind of life architecture of discipleship and worldview that will really stay strong in a city like this and on the internet?
So good. Just how do people respond to this series on a future church and some of the ways that you were inviting them into this kind of picture of community?
I think mostly good, better than I expected to. I mean, anytime you kind of call a spade, it's like a dividing kind of the sheep and the goats moment. That's a little judgmental. I don't mean to sound unkind, but we lost some people because they're not on board with Christian orthodoxy, and people are complex and they're in church for all sorts of different reasons. And, we're just these ambiguous, beautiful image bearers of God. And so people are all on their own journey, and I respect that, but it's hard not to grieve it at the same time too. So, there was kind of a carving out, like I would say what was left of our church after was much stronger, but also a little bit smaller than it was before, and that's okay, even if it's sad. And then anytime you talk about rule of life or commitment to practices from the way of Jesus, that always is hard for certain personality types, especially kind of high P, Myers-Briggs kind of, or kind of don't tell me what to do kind of people. So everything we do is invitational. It's not heavy-handed. It's not like if you're going to be a part of our church, you will fast every Thursday. It's more like, hey, this is our rhythm of life. This is how we live together. We're inviting you into this. Would love to have you prayerfully contextualize this for your own thing. So it's a mix, but I would say overall, I felt like it purified our church. Our worship gatherings coming through that time and coming out of it were just more intense than ever before. There was just a real sense of hunger in the room and a real sense of commitment. People that are deconstructing and angry at Christian orthodoxy, they're not going to listen to a sermon from me and probably turn around. That's probably not going to happen. Probably a sermon from me is just going to make them more mad. And so a sermon from me is just going to become a point of resistance. And so I just pray that God does his wonderful work in those people. I'm probably not the person that God will use in their life. But the people, and there's of course people that are just strong, solid Christians that are already in the boat, and they're just like, great. And you just have to warn them against self-righteousness. Great. So the people that I'm really trying to pastor are all those people in the middle that genuinely love Jesus and genuinely want to stay faithful to Jesus, but they're living in this incredibly secular culture. and they're on the internet and they're in Portland, and they find their heart drifting. And I had so many conversations with people say, hey, thank you. I didn't realize I drifted. Like my heart had drifted in a couple of these areas. And this was a wake up moment for me. And I'm following Jesus. I'm in our community. It brought me back.
Yeah,
And
that's cool.
those conversations, that was what we did it for. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's 50 people in our church or 500 people I don't know, but that's what we did it for.
Certainly during COVID, you referenced this even about the sermon series that people, might have chosen to leave Bridgetown, but certainly during COVID, I think every church in America and perhaps around the world has had the experience of people leaving without saying goodbye, or people now being gone.
Yeah.
How do you hold yourself together? I mean, every pastor has to deal with that sort of separation anxiety of losing people that leave for the right reasons, they leave for the wrong reasons, they say goodbye the wrong way, or they don't say goodbye. How are you holding yourself up and sort of through the pain of losing maybe a higher percentage of a greater number of people during this season?
Yeah, it's really painful. I mean, and often they just don't not leave with honoring you. They'll often leave attacking you, Let me give you not my practical advice. Let me give you practical advice from somebody way smarter. So I got the chance. I'm not sure if you're a fan at all of the Catholic writer Ronald Rolheiser, my favorite living Catholic writer. His book Sacred Fire, I just pass out to like every single Christian over the age of 30. It's such a gift. Anyway, I got the chance last summer to interview him on like an online pastors conference. Remember back when we were doing those, and they were cool for about 3 seconds. And so I got the chance to interview him, and I'm like fanboying out. I'm not even trying to play sophisticated. I mean, this is like he and Dallas Willard were kind of like, I mean, these two men shaped me so deeply, And so I'm fanboying out. I'm not even trying to ask questions for other pastors. I'm just asking them my questions because it's like the worst summer of my entire ministry in 20 years. And I'm like ready to quit. And I'm just like begging for help, so I just ask them my questions. And one of my questions was exactly that. I use this, it's a long conversation here, but the language of projection from psychology and transference from psychology. Projection, where people kind of take stuff that's in them that they don't like. It might be latent racism, or it might be misogyny, or it could be anything, and they project it onto you as a coping mechanism to kind of, if they can make you the scapegoat, then they can feel no guilt or shame. And then transference, where you there's a transfer from somebody else who hurt them or wounded them in their past, that their body, even if it's not conscious, kind of interprets you that way. And if you are a white male pastor, that anybody who's ever been hurt by a pastor, by a white person, by a man, by a father, you have the potential to be like in their body's memory, which has been deeply wounded by that person. They can emotionally experience you as that person, even though they know in their brain that you're not. And then they can treat you as if you were that person, as if you've wronged them, like somebody else similar to you has wronged them. And those are deeply painful wounds that you receive as a pastor, other people's projection and transference. It's, I think, deep in Paul's theology of, I think Paul's theology of pastoring is basically, pastoring is suffering love, and it's vicarious at some level. You're not suffering for other people's atonement, but you are letting death into your body in order to release the life of Jesus into others. And so anyway, I asked Rolheiser, like, this transference thing is killing me. Like, I've never been so criticized, so attacked, and so much of it is unjust. Like, I'm not getting accused of doing things that I actually did. This is just like, I'm getting blamed for everybody's pain and anger right now. I'm just like a punching bag. I was feeling very sorry for myself. And I was like, even when I pray, there's a couple of people in our church that have been in our church for years. And then when all the BLM stuff went off, they were just so, so mad. And I was just deeply hurt by them. Anyway, so I said, how do I do even a prayer? I can't deal with this. My mind is like angry. And he gave such a classic Catholic answer. No evangelical would say this. He said, well, yes, pray. But then he said, but do you drink alcohol? And he said it like he wasn't being sarcastic. I was like, well yeah, but no, I don't get drunk, like in moderation. And he's like, well, okay, well, I would get a bottle of something really good, and I would maybe sit around a fire pit or something with some of your colleagues who do what you do. And I would just commiserate a little bit. And he said, you're human. You have to offload this pain, but you can't offload it on your people. You have to absorb it so that they can offload it onto you. But you need a place to offload it. So yes, prayer, but why don't you get a few of your close colleagues around and just offload and just commiserate a little and pray for each other. So I've been doing that since last summer with about 10 of the core leaders of our church. We call it a transference meeting. No joke. I should not say this online, but we broke some COVID rules and we sat around the fire pit on my back deck, even in winter. And we would pour a couple bottles of wine for everybody. And we would just laugh and cry and talk about who got attacked and hurt that week. And we'd pray for each other and we'd affirm each other. And I knew that even if our church fell apart, this dozen people, we were community and we were faithful to each other and we were going to love each other through this. So that is the most practical advice I can give you, which is not even from me, but it's what I've been doing. And it's been some of the highlights of the last year of my life.
Yeah, that's so good. Quick last question. What are you seeing coming out of COVID or just generally in sort of the way you're thinking about things in terms of the practice of prayer and how Christian communities can embody that? Such an important part of our centering on who the Lord is and who we are and communicating with the Lord. What are you seeing about sort of trends related to prayer today?
I think I just heard this great story about a church in New York City that's planting, and the church planter is a solid Orthodox guy, as far as I understand. The number one question he got from New Yorkers about prayer, about anything connected to Christian spirituality, was, can I meditate? So he basically built his church planting formula around offering like pop-up meditations as their like strategy for evangelism, for lack of a better word. And they're doing it in their Sunday gatherings. I thought that was fascinating. Coming out of COVID, we've been trying to work some contemplative practices into our actual Sunday gatherings, Lectio Divina, listening prayer, silence, imaginative prayer. All that to say, I grew up in a church tradition where there was a lot of talk about prayer, but prayer in my mind was synonymous with intercession and petition. Prayer was asking God for things on behalf of myself or others, rather than thinking of that as one aspect of prayer, whatever slice of the pie, but this much larger kind of experience of union with God. So I think there is an ancient, like Christian, global, historic Christian Orthodox practice of contemplative prayer. And I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. Silent prayer, listening prayer, breathing prayer, the Jesus prayer. My therapist, who's a strong Christian PhD, would say that mindfulness is actually more Christian than Buddhist. It's more Sermon on the Mount than it is Siddhartha. But because we live in a post-Christian society, it's not kosher to say that. So psychologists will bring it in as if it's from Buddhism, but actually it has as strong or stronger roots in Christian history. Maybe not so much in Protestantism. That would be, of course, mostly in Eastern Orthodox Christianity, but still it's there. So all that to say, I think this is both a desperate need for Christians and possibly an open door to non-Christians, helping people recapture forms of, if you want to use this language, contemplative prayer, quiet prayer, silent prayer, resting prayer. Rolheiser's definition of prayer as relaxing into God's goodness. Douglas Steer's definition to pray is to pay attention to the deepest thing I know. Prayer as surrender, prayer is not my will, but your will be done. That is where I am just finding every morning, David, I have lots of issues and lots of struggles and problems, but I love Jesus and I love to get up in the morning. I did it today and just sit in front of this window and just be quiet and just receive his love and love him in return. Sometimes with the words of a psalm, sometimes not. I love that. And it is most of the time the highlight of my day. And the more normative that experience becomes for Christians all over the world, I think we're going to see a revolution of maturity, of non-anxious presence, of courage, of differentiation from the world, of holiness, and of joy, Yeah. So when I think of prayer and the future of prayer, I think, yes, petition, intercession, we need more of that, not less. But how do we teach people to be quiet with God? And how do we even turn our churches from rock concert venues there's a place for that, to places where people naturally come to collect themselves and come to quiet before God. I think that's the great task.
Such a beautiful vision. I think I know where to end the podcast. John Mark Comer, thanks so much for joining us on Church Pulse Weekly. And
Thanks for having me on.
would you mind just praying for our listeners? It feels like a thing to do.
Yeah. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, thank you for your presence and your love. We ask that you would help us to attend to the deepest thing we know, to Christ in us, the hope of glory. Let us live from that deep place of peace, of abiding, of resting, of living, Jesus, as you said, in you, the branch in the vine. And let us bear good fruit, God, the fruit of the Spirit, as well as the fruit of courage, trust, and obedience, and allegiance to you, Jesus, as Lord. Let us live for your pleasure and approval, not that of man or woman or Instagram or Twitter or our email or church or politics. And come what come, God, let us stay faithful to you and to your love. We love you and thank you. Amen.
Amen. Wow, what a moment. I hope that was helpful to you. That really spoke to me. I've been thinking and meditating a lot and praying a lot in the last couple of months. And I was sort of blown away by John Mark's response to that question and then his prayer for us. So I hope that was encouraging to you all as you're thinking about sort of staying grounded in your ministry today.
And, I would just say, John Mark's new book is great. His thoughts are so helpful to me. They really help shape my worldview. I love his idea of doing a biopsy of culture and how much that can help us sort of separating the wheat from the chaff, the lies we believe from the truth of God. But also, I would just say, as hopefully friend to friend, listener to listener, remember to ruthlessly eliminate hurry. That was John Mark's next most recent book. And a quote directly from Dallas Willard is told to John Ortberg that you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And as we move into really 18 months of just this now chronic crisis and state of upheaval, I think that's going to be so important for your soul to stay alive, for you to stay fresh in leadership. And we're really grateful for you. So we're just committed to being alongside you. Thank you so much for listening. If this episode is helpful, please share it with your team. Please let us know on social. And we're going to do more of this.